All right. Good morning. Good morning, Aparna. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great. Well, on behalf of Gender Ideal, welcome. I'm Flory Wilson. I am the founder and CEO of Gender Ideal. I'm delighted to have you all joining us for the third of 10 LinkedIn Lives. Oops, I'm having one audio issue. Just hold on a moment.
I can.
Okay. All right, I had to mute myself. Okay, we're delighted to have you join us for the third of 10 LinkedIn Live sessions. This series explores the concept covered in the IDEAL12 assessment. We hope you will walk away from each of these conversations with the insight on how to be an advocate inside of your organization, on why and how to begin implementation of these practices. Links to this video and the other videos that are part of the series and additional resources can be found on the resources page of the Gender Ideal website. This series supports the IDEAL12 campaign, which we launched in March of 2022, and it's designed to be a first step for companies to benchmark their performance on the 12 core practices included in the IDEAL12 that have impact on gender equity in the workplace. We encourage everyone on this call or watching the video to participate in the IDEAL12 on behalf of your organization. When you complete the IDEAL12 assessment, you receive a score out of 12 points and have access to a benchmark report. And we encourage companies to then make a commitment to one of those 12 core issues covered in the IDEAL12, or if you scored near or at 12 points, we encourage you to move on to taking the full Gender Ideal assessment. You can learn more about all of this on our website, www.gender-ideal.org. I am really looking forward to our conversation today with Aparna Ray. Aparna is a multi-startup founder working at the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusivity, DEI, and employee voice. She is the founder of Moving Beyond, a startup that builds solutions to solve complex DE&I and people challenges using real-time employee voice and impact data, experiential e-learning, and an innovative lab approach grounded in human-centered design. Prior to Moving Beyond, she grew Firki, India's first online teacher education platform, which supported nearly 1 million teachers in 10 states across India. And in 2019, she launched Future for Us, a platform to advance women of color at work, and grew that into a community, a professional community of over 11,000 women. I also want to add that Aparna does sit on the board of Gender Ideal, so she is really familiar with our work. And with that, let's go ahead and dig in. So Aparna, we'll start with the basics. Why should organizations conduct workplace climate surveys? What are the risks of not conducting a survey? And what are the benefits of conducting employee climate surveys, workplace climate surveys?
Yeah. Hi, Flory. Thanks for having me on today. So I think before I talk about why somebody should do a climate survey, I want to just point out the difference between climate and culture. So there's, a lot of people will say we need better work culture. We need, we want to transform organizational culture. And I think that the miss in that language of culture is that culture can mean anything and everything, and it's so many things. It's not a thing that's easy to measure. And so when we think about employee voice and surveying, we really think from the point of view of climate. And climate is, what is expected of employees, how people are supported at work, and how people are rewarded. And, ideally, you want to have an organization where what's, for instance, rewarded is what's expected. So people are expected to work 35-hour work weeks, but the ones that are being rewarded are the ones that are like working 60-hour work weeks, and there's a lack of alignment. So that's why we use the language of climate. And at the end of the day, right, like in order to build a diverse, inclusive, and equitable work environment for everybody, not just for a few people or not just for the status quo, we need to know what it takes to actually create that environment. sitting, at a leadership level, or in any part of the organization, we don't know what contributes or distracts from equity and inclusion, right? Is it policies and practices? Is it like the values and beliefs of individuals? So we can't take steps to change our workplaces if we don't know what's making them behave the way they are. And also, I think ultimately, because things are finite, budgets are finite, time is finite. I mean, we could totally have a like woo abundance mindset and manifest time, but I don't think I can manifest a 36-hour workday. So because things are finite, we also want to make sure that companies are allocating resources where they're going to make a difference, right? So, like, do you need to invest in training? Do you need to invest in supporting managers? Do you actually need to put your money in having pay equity, right? Like these are all different choices that a company can make. And so companies want to do climate surveys so they know where to make that investment.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit about, I don't think I heard you mention any like risks of not doing it. Do you have any specific risks or cautionary tales even that you can share?
Yeah, so I would say here's the thing, I wouldn't maybe say the risk of not doing it. I would say the pro of doing it is you have actionable information, right? Like if you use a good instrument, if you ask good questions, if you collect demographic information, which I think is like absolutely critical, then you start to get some meaty insights. The risk is if you collect this data and you do nothing about it,
Mhm.
people are going to be really upset. People are going to be really upset, and they're going to take that, and it's going to show up on Glassdoor, and it's going to show up on LinkedIn, and it's going to show up if you're a big company on Blind, right? It's going to show up on social media.
Mhm.
People's like dissatisfaction and discontentment with companies continuously asking them for like, hey, what do you need? How are you feeling? And then kind of not taking action. And so I would say if you're going to do it, be ready to take some action and be ready to share back what you're learning. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it.
Yeah. Okay, so the risk is doing it but not doing it well, and that's a perfect segue to the next question, which is, in your view, what are the best practices for implementing a surveying approach?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot of commentary for us at Moving Beyond. We believe in good science and transparency. And the good science part of it is don't make up survey questions. Please don't do that. Like, literally, there are people with PhDs that have spent like years of their lives learning the science of survey construction, right? And understanding how to make these tools reliable. And so, the first thing that I would say, and especially I think to like smaller organization or low resource environments where you might think, hey, I'm just going to put together 30 questions and ask my employees that, um, they're not going to be reliable. So I would say start with a good instrument, and there are lots of good instruments, right? And in fact, there are lots of open source instruments as well, so you can get a good product either free or cheap. The second is really socialize it, which requires on the back end establishing a purpose for doing it, and establishing what you're going to do with the data, right? And sharing it ahead of time. We always tell like our customers that the day that a longer engagement survey hits an employee's inbox, that shouldn't be the first time they're hearing about it, right? So they should have heard about it a couple of times, so that when it hits their inbox, like they're excited and they're gonna share that information. I think it's also important to offer transparency and, sorry, not transparency, well, anonymity and confidentiality, right? So not linking or not going down this rabbit hole of figuring out, hey, like, is this Florrie's response? No, you don't want to do that, right? Because the minute that you don't offer both anonymity and confidentiality, you break trust with employees. And especially, I think, if your workplace climate is not inclusive, maybe there's, some funk. I don't want to use the word toxic, but like, let's say just things are a little bumpy. Um, in that environment, especially, it's important to offer confidentiality. And I think that, you know, there's like what's popular and what's ethical, and sometimes that Venn diagram, they overlap and sometimes they don't, right? And so I would say that, especially if you're in a low trust environment, you want to outsource some of this work.
Mhm.
um, and the second is, you don't want to run it through your HRIS, because then there's going to always be a back door to figuring out a person's response or a group's response. um we also like we also know that there's like good employee voice surveying, and then there are like employee listening tools like Perceptics that are actually reading people's emails and Slack messages. And I think that we don't talk enough about the fact that, like, part of a standard employment contract is companies can read any piece of communication, right? Anything that's on a company channel, companies own it, they can read it, and they can do whatever they want with it. And so um, it's, yeah, I mean, in like a healthy environment, that those tools can be like really great proactive tools. And in most workplace environments, because they're not healthy, um, it's gonna cause issues. And so be really clear about what your goal is. And your goal is, like, I want to hear from my employees directly. I don't want to go like crawling into their email and make assumptions about what they're thinking and feeling.
I have two follow-on questions just about practices. The first
Yeah.
is, can you talk a little bit about who should be involved? Obviously, HR, and maybe they're kind of running the process. Who else should be
Yeah.
involved in this process is my first question. And my
Yeah.
second is budget, right? Like, to your point
Mm,
earlier, do not do this if you're not going to do something with the data. In
yeah.
addition to thinking about budget to implement the surveys, do you recommend companies allocate budget to then be able to fund whatever activities need to come out based on results?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? Like, budgets are budgets are an insight into priorities. Um, Whether it's the budget at a team level, at the company level, our government, right? 50% of our budget in the US, the government's budget, is military spending, right? And so, because budgets are an insight into a company's priority, I think, I used to say for years, I would say, do you spend more on DEI or swag? Do you spend more on DEI or snacks? And I had clients, like, I literally have had clients over the years that spend way more money on snacks, on like holiday parties, on, like cute tumblers with the company logo than they do on DEI.
Mm.
And so, um, yeah, if you don't adequately resource something, it's not going to go very far. And we know that in every aspect of our life. Now, so who should be in the room? Senior leaders should be in the room. Decision makers should be in the room. And I think that, yes, of course, HR and like the DEI leaders, they can own it, but it needs to be jointly. Um, it needs to have like greater ownership of the whole leadership team. That's who needs to be in the room. And that's, in fact, who needs to be in the room when the results come out. And I think that if leaders really want their companies to be better for people, right? Not just for profitability, if they want companies to be better for people, then they can't be in the boardroom wanting one nice, tidy slide with all of the information, right? Like, they have to actually engage with the process end to end. And um, like, another risk is, like, if the leadership doesn't care, it's not going to go very far,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
If they're not curious, if they're not asking, the hard questions about why certain groups of people in their company are not faring so well, yeah, I mean, that's you're not going to make progress on workplace climate.
Let's talk a little bit then about, and I think you mentioned this earlier, but um, so it is not legal for companies to require all of their employees to disclose, uh, identity characteristics such as sexual orientation,
Yeah,
ability, race, ethnicity, etc. And
yeah.
that, and I'm asking you about this because this is what I've heard from many companies. Oh, we just can't, yeah, we would love to be able to segment workplace climate
Hmm.
data in a more granular
Yeah.
level, but we just can't do it. So, how would you respond to that?
Hmm.
How can companies collect this data while complying with law? And is it your recommendation that companies are trying to collect as much detailed identity data as possible?
Yeah. So I mean, I have to give the disclaimer that I'm not an attorney, I'm not an employment lawyer, right? But it is completely legal to ask for demographic information as long as it's optional and it's shared willingly by the employees, right? And this is why I also recommend um don't have it connected to your HRIS, right? Like let it be self-identified. Um but I think beyond that, it's important to say that like the law was not written for equity and inclusion. Literally, like laws in the United States as they govern our workplaces are not written for equity and inclusion. They're written to protect companies. They're written to protect the powers that be, and so what's legal, what's not legal, like I think is kind of a fuzzy boundary. At the end of the day, we know that race, gender, zip code, whether you're immigrant or first gen, whether you're a native English speaker, right? Like these are all identity characteristics that have an outsized impact on the outcomes that we experience, both at work and outside of work, right? Like our health, our access to opportunities, our access to food. And so to not collect information that actually offers you insights about why things are happening is a miss,
Mhm.
right? So outsource it if you have real concerns. And yeah, I mean, if you're a company of a certain size, right? If you have more than 100 employees, you have to collect that information. Like you need to report. You have to submit the EEO report. And yeah, so I think that I think it's easier to create myths than to be accountable.
Yep. The other thing I would add to that, we did an interview a couple of weeks ago about that topic specifically. And what I was struck by was just similar to what you've said, but be really clear about why you are collecting that data, how you're going to store it, who would have access to it, and how it's going to be used. And then people are more likely to share the data. So this idea of, oh, people don't want to give it, or, oh, we don't want to, there are actually pretty solvable ways
Yeah,
to handle that.
that's
Okay,
right.
so now let's go back into we're in this process. We have collected
Hmm.
what happens next once you've the data is rolling in. What does a
Yeah,
company do with the data? Who should the findings be shared with?
yeah,
What should you be doing with the findings?
yeah. What indeed? Yeah, what happens once you have the data, right? So, once you have the data, you need to draw the through line to insights, right? Data in and of itself is useful, but it doesn't tell you the whole story, right? And for the story, you need context. Um, I think that um, this is another place where there are lots of, I think, myths and misconceptions around data. Like people think it'll either do nothing or it'll solve for everything, but I think the reality is somewhere in the middle, and I'll give you an example. So last year around this time, we were working with a bunch of companies, and some were experiencing really significant turnover, and others were experiencing a negligible amount of turnover, right? And the context there was we saw that our customers that were in healthcare and service industries were the ones that were experiencing that churn. And the context there is we know what was happening in the world, right? And so the data alone will tell you something. It'll tell you, yeah, there's a lot of churn. But why is it happening, right? Like, it's not because your company is unique or your company is particularly bad. It's because it's happening within this industry across the country.
Mhm.
Right. And there were other industries that experienced very little churn, right? Because they just were protected. Their workers maybe had good remote work habits. They were also a lot of the higher earning industries, right? So they just kind of were well set up to survive the pandemic. So I would say once you have the data, draw out the insights, help like really figure out, what's happening, why is it happening? And then in an ideal scenario, you're gonna then prioritize your actions and you're gonna say, these are some quick fixes, right? People are saying, I don't have transparency about goals, KPIs, whatever. That's a pretty easy fix. You can release that information. You might find also, for instance, like there's some like challenges around pay equity. Well, that is not a quick fix. The quick fix is like being transparent that there are pay gaps,
Mhm.
because people prefer to know. People always prefer transparency. And the longer term fix is like you have to find the money to close it.
Right.
So prioritizing those things. And then I think, like sharing that with at least sharing that with their employees, at least sharing that with managers of people and decision makers, because ultimately, like good company climate, it and DEI, it doesn't grow in the dark, right? Um, and what I've noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed this as well, companies that are healthy, companies that have closed the wage gap, companies that have good benefits and like policies and practices,
Mhm.
they are talking about it. They're talking about it, right? Like we have companies like Buffer that make all the pay data fully transparent by name and location.
Wow. Wow.
So the ones that are doing a good job, like they're not afraid to share it. And so I often think, when someone's not sharing something, like what's really happening?
Well,
So
okay,
share it.
so I'm curious. I mean, and I've definitely heard this as well. Gosh, we don't want to do the surveying because we're not sure we can effectively address what comes up. And
Yeah.
so my question to you would be, do the survey, be transparent about the results, whether they're good or
Yeah.
really bad. But that
Yeah.
does, I mean, is there ever an instance when you would say to a client, let's not share these results? Or is it always your advice, share the results?
My advice is always share something.
Mhm.
My advice is always share something, right? Like I'm not gonna suggest to a client that they share really damning data that results in some kind of a class action lawsuit. Right? I obviously would not. A couple of years ago, we had an instance where, we surveyed a nonprofit organization, a large nonprofit organization, and we saw like a pretty big chunk of their employees having some serious mental health issues and lots of sort of suicidal ideation, right? That is hard, heavy stuff. Um, I wouldn't share that. I wouldn't say 30% of our employees are struggling with their mental health, and our data shows that many of you are like contemplating this like horrible thing, right? I wouldn't share that, right? Or if it's revealed, for instance, that all of the lowest earners in an organization are people of color. Probably wouldn't reveal that. Like you're just setting yourself up for bad press is maybe the best thing that could happen to you, or like the AG is going to be looking into you.
Right.
Um, so share mindfully, share intentionally. but make a plan to share. Um, and the very least, you can say, hey, here are things that our company is mostly aligned on. You know, people really like their managers and like they love that they can use their flexible work policies. Or, you know, we saw really low rates or negligible, you know, workplace discrimination, right? These are good things. And hey, here are things, you know, our survey revealed that we have a little bit of work to do, you know, and it may be like promotion pathways are not clear, or people don't really have time and space to learn, or they don't have the resources to learn, right? So in the very least, lay that out.
Yeah, that makes sense. You have mentioned that you do this type of work with many clients. Can you tell us more? I know you're about to launch a new tool too. So can you tell us about Moving Beyond's toolkit and what your
Yeah.
methodology is?
Yeah, we launched it last week, and yeah, so we've created a workplace climate assessment, um, what I would say is maybe unique or different about our approach is that it's data backed, but really it's reflective of today's workforce, right? We know that there are lots of great employee experience products on the market, tons and tons of them. But most of them are built on pretty dated research, you know, like research from the 90s, or even older research. And um, what are the populations that those tools were tested on, right? Mostly white, middle, upper middle class folks. And so they really reflect a time and place and a point of view. You know, for instance, like a lot of the research on leadership, it's focused on white men. And so now, if we're going to go measure great leadership, we're measuring it vis-a-vis qualities of white men from the 90s. And like neither one of us is that, right? And we're both leaders. And so when we set out to build this instrument, we really said that we wanted to build and test it in a really diverse environment. And so we went out and worked with lots of membership organizations and community groups so that we could over index, like essentially over survey immigrants, LGBTQIA plus folks, women of color, right? Like groups that we know are having a less positive experience at work, and really figuring out how to measure their experience in a really reliable way. So, um, so that's right, that's the methodology, that's the science. It also it also sort of looks at diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of the organizational and employee experience, right? Because DEI isn't something that's happening here and then the rest of the organization is functioning here, right? So, where do those values and beliefs and priorities cut across things like performance management and hiring and recruiting and manager support, right? Like, this is the day to day of an organization. So, we want to measure that. We don't want to just measure things like belonging and fairness in isolation, because they are not happening in isolation. Um, the other thing, you know, that we wanted to do with this assessment or and in this product is really simplify things. Like, I don't think it's the responsibility of HR leaders or DEI leaders to be experts in survey design or analysis or drawing insights, right? Um, and so how do we make it really simple and easy for them to like pinpoint what's happening? And so we've built a tool that is intentionally simple. It's intentionally doesn't talk to an HRIS because we want to protect, you know, anonymity. And while our tool doesn't do this, you know, we don't publicly report on the data in our system today. One of the things that we are really working towards is how do we democratize access to this kind of data and these kinds of tools, right? How do we make them open source so people can leverage them? For the time being, the thing that we've done is we've really lowered the bar for entry. It's free for small shops. If you have, a team of 10 or a company with 10 or fewer, you can use it for free. And it's still a really great experience. And if you're bigger, and because we know that people's spending on HR and DEI tends to be pretty small, um, it's $10 an employee per year.
That is, I mean, it sounds like you've been incredibly intentional, uh, thorough in your research, and deliberate in the design, and it fills a really unique position in the marketplace. That's very exciting. And folks, I assume if they go to movingbeyond.com, can learn more about the tools. I know we have had a number of companies that have taken the gender ideal assessment and that have not been doing any surveying. Um,
Yeah,
so I think there's a lot of interest in the market for the tool. We are out of time. Can I ask you one more question, and we'll just
yes.
go a couple minutes over? Okay. Um,
Mm,
so a lot of the companies actually that have taken the gender ideal assessment or the IDEAL12 and that aren't yet doing surveying, when I talk to them about it, their concern is we're too small. We have 50 employees. We are working
mm,
on our diversity. We're being intentional in our recruiting, but we only have a handful of, colleagues of color, or colleagues who are women, or colleagues who are, pick
yeah,
your identity characteristic. And so, what
yeah,
would you say to those organizations? What's your advice for them? How can they get started?
yeah. How can you get started? Go do it. Go do it. Maybe you only have a handful of people that are in a protected class, or that are, people of color. You don't have to share out the those results, right? In our platform, we don't share back any data unless there's at least three people in an identity group. And in a small company, you know who those three people are, right? So there isn't a whole lot of anonymity there. But I think that without actually collecting data and hearing directly from your employees, there really isn't accountability. Like, if a leader tells me we're doing good things, and I'm like, how do you know? Right? Is it anecdotal evidence of like one person? And it's often anecdotal evidence from like a couple of conversations they've had, right? But even if you have 50 employees, unless you're chatting with all 50 of your people on a regular basis, you don't know. So um, it's good organization hygiene to actually have, surveys as part of like your rhythm of business. Collect it, have some safeguards when you review it and how you share it, but don't not collect it because you think you're too small.
And as you're saying all of that, I'm thinking about a phrase you used earlier too, this concept of a low trust or high trust work environment. And I imagine you can build that trust if you're doing this thoughtfully,
Yeah,
in a safe way that protects those individuals, and have as a result building more trust amongst employees and between employees and management.
yeah.
Aparna, I feel like I could keep talking to you for another 30 minutes on this topic. I am grateful for your time and your expertise. I've learned a lot today, and I think everyone who's joined us has as well. And so thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.